Continue today talking about ancient Greece. I'm going to kind of mostly talk about, obviously, the rise of the Greek city-states. It's one of the things we'll talk about, which the Greek city-states are often called polis or a poli, which is, by the way, the plural name of a Greek city-state. That's what they call it, civilization to them. Also, I will talk about the rise and rivalry of Sparta and Athens. It's kind of like LSU and Alabama around here, Louisiana, right? It's kind of like that. I'm not sure which is which. But obviously, they kind of affect the Greek world. They both get involved in the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, that are later. They're also involved in the Peloponnesian War, where they kind of get in a civil war with each other. That ends up kind of killing, the whole ancient classical period. But anyway, so that's the main topics, of course, I'll get to today. And I should have time to maybe start on, talking about the Greco-Persian War. Probably won't finish it, but I'll kind of talk more about it, of course, later in the week on Wednesday. So like I said, I'm going to continue talking about ancient Greece. Of course, I'll get to first, and I'll talk about kind of what happens before, I guess I get into the Hellenic Age. The Hellenic Age is kind of a term I'll get to more into later, that they kind of describe the period of the ancient Greeks, like during the so-called mostly classical period and all that. I'll get into later. Mostly occurs from like the 8th century to about the 4th centuries BC. So it's about 4 or 5 centuries we're looking at right there. So yeah, 776 to 323. It's about the period of when that occurs. And one of the things, of course, that happens during that time, I think I talked about this, how the Mycenaeans had declined. I think I already got to that already. We last thing I talked about was the Mycenaean Greece with the Trojan War period. But I think I told you they collapsed during the so-called late Bronze Age collapse that happened close to about 1200 when Greece got invaded. Maybe the Sea Peoples and all those other peoples I kind of talked about that may have come in at that point. And it caused the decline of a lot of these Bronze Age cultures, not just the Mycenaeans, but they think it was also affected, like the Hittites, and I think also the New Kingdom of Egypt was also affected by it as well. I thought we mentioned, I think we talked about the Greek Dark Ages. That came in next. Greece declined over a period of a few centuries, maybe about the 11th to about the 8th centuries. Yeah, the early Iron Age comes in. So people start bringing in iron weapons at that time. And one of the groups that comes in that's famous, that's well known, is the so-called Hellenes, that they're dubbed, which is just the Greek name that they call the Greeks in ancient times and also in modern times, as well as the Greek-speaking peoples that inhabit Greece. And they often call it different names. Some people call it the Dorian invasion because that was one of the main Greek peoples that came in at that time. And they would settle throughout the Aegean basin, not just in the Greek mainland, but in the islands of the Aegean, in western Turkey. I think the northern coast of Turkey. Yeah, the northern coast of Turkey, and also into like Thrace and all that, which is upper part of the Aegean. As well. And the term Hellen or Hellenes, also the term for Greece today is Hellas, Hellas, usually, I guess, in the transliteration of Greek. But they're named after this ancient ancestor who was named Hellen, Hellen, who they're not sure who Hellen was. It's believed to be some kind of ancestral king or leader of theirs, kind of like a Greek version of Jacob, maybe, like the Israelites. But he's the one that supposedly founded the Greek peoples that settled, in the Iron Age. And all the different tribes that they have later are often named after his children or his grandchildren, they believe, which those are the different tribes that would eventually settle throughout the Greek peninsulas, an area of the Aegean basin. The so-called Dorians, which are the most famous of the Greek tribes, Ionians, and then the Aeolians, and they have another one called the Achaeans, which Homer also used as well. Their names, by the way, come from like the kids, like the children and all that. So Aeolus came from Aeolians, Doris, another son, Dorians, Xuthus is, I think, the Achaeans, supposedly. And Ionians are related to these other two, which are Achaeus also in Ion. So Ion is where you get Ionian from, I believe. So also, oh, hey, Hannah, good morning. You're doing great out there today. And also Shelby looks like she's joining us also as well. I have other slides also as well to show you. Of course, here you have this one you can blow up right there. But yeah, here kind of is a map showing you the region of the Aegean Sea. So they believe that most of the Dorian people, the Greeks that came in, settled primarily in that area, which is in the Peloponnese, which would be like basically in the southern part of Greece. I'll get more into the Peloponnese, but it's this Greek peninsula, which is on the bottom of Greece. It's kind of jetting out into the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea and all that. And it's like a four-fingered hand. So you see Sparta right here, like a Dorian state right there. Of course, it's in that area right there. Also, other areas like the Ionian peoples kind of settled like around that area, I think in the north as well. And also, I think most of your Ionian peoples also settled right here in Western Turkey. We call it Ionia. Aeolians, you can see, kind of settled here, like in northwestern Turkey. Lesbos maybe also as well, you can see right there. So just kind of like some of the different peoples that, settled throughout the Aegean basin. And what's going to happen, of course, over time is that these Greek peoples will eventually, what's going to occur is they're going to create like states that'll kind of merge together over like, I guess, a couple centuries there. And so after the Dark Ages, you get this deal where the so-called rise of the polis comes in, or poli, which is the so-called Greek city-state. That's their term for what they call civilization. The word polis, by the way, is where you get a lot of terms from today you may have heard of, like police, policy. The word politics evolves from that word. It was also the early term, at least in Greek, what they call civilization or a city, basically. So they had hundreds of these, throughout the Aegean basin that were there. But the ones that were the most famous ones that were in the Aegean basin, I'll blow up, were, I'll show them right here on the screen. But like I just mentioned, Sparta, which is right here, Pylos, Olympia, Argos, Corinth, of course, Athens right here, so-called Attica Peninsula, they call it. Plataea and Thebes, you may have heard of that. Delphi, where they had a famous temple there of Apollo. Eboa was considered basically like a city-state, which is right here. These are other states up here, or regions. Thessaly, of course, in that area, Thessalia. Boeotia, right here. That's Attica down here. Macedon, which is later a state, or Macedonia. I think Pella is one of their, basically one of their cities that was there. Thrace is up here. Thrace, like up in the northern Aegean. Now, I told you Ionia was over here in that region, which was kind of like an area that was colonized by the Athenians and other Greeks that came in later. So kind of giving you a tour of that area. Now, the Hellenic age, by the way, is usually divided into two different periods. Of course, the term Hellenic, by the way, I'll put it on the screen. The term Hellenic is just a term that they apply to describe like ancient Greek history, its culture, the art of that period, and also the Greek people as well they're talking about. So the term Hellenic, just talking about the Greek people. So I guess Hellenic age would mean like the age of the Greeks, kind of is what it means, basically. You can see the terms where they get the term, Hellenic, whatever. Hellas is just, like I said, the Greek name for what they call continental Greece and the country of Greece, Republic of Greece, which is today. Also, a Greek person or persons is a Hellen or Hellenes. Basically, it's the Greek term. The term Greece or Grecia is a Roman term. The Romans, of course, used it later, just where that came from originally. So yeah, the Hellenic Age or Greek Age is divided into really two sub-periods, which last about 4 or 5 centuries. 8th century to about 323 BC, you can see there. And it usually starts with what we call Archaic Greece, which Archaic Greece means kind of like Old Greece, going back to the 8th century. And for a long time, I don't know if you know about the Greeks, but ancient times, they dated Greek culture back to when the Olympics started, which they think the Olympics started in Greece around 776, the city-state of Olympia. But maybe. It may have started earlier or later. It's hard to say. But that's the traditional date of when the ancient Greece supposedly started that we know of. And then the classical period goes from like around 500, like when the Greco-Persian Wars start. And they go down to the death of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC. There is a period later I'll get to, which is called the Hellenistic Age. Let's realize that's right there. Which, yeah, here it is, Hellenistic Age. Hellenistic Age goes from 323 to 30 BC, a little later. That's the period where Alexander the Great conquers like Persia, and they spread Greek culture to the east. And it's kind of a synthesis of Greek and other cultures that kind of influence the Near East and all that. Of course, the classical period, what we call classical Greece, is like, it's called all kinds of names. People sometimes call it the Golden Age of Greece, the Golden Age of Athens. Some people call it the so-called Age of Pericles, like in the middle of it, like in the fifth century, I think it is. Yeah, mid 5th century. But it's the peak of all the different classical Greek culture, art, history, philosophy. So all your great philosophers, historians, famous people, all lived during that time. So Herodotus, you can see there, father of history, one of the first historians. Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, those are all famous Greek philosophers you may have heard of. Of course, Sophocles, probably the greatest Greek playwright, wrote that famous play called Oedipus Rex. Alexander the Great, of course, great, conqueror, Macedonian, of course, who conquered Persia. Pericles is probably one of the most famous of the Greek politicians from Athens. I should throw in there Solon. Solon, you may have heard of Solon. It's also, of course, Athenian politician who was also famous as well. There's a lot of famous Greek people, but most of them live in the 5th, 4th centuries, the big ones. You study about that period, the classical Greece anyway. All right, I'm going to get on next. I'm going to, of course, move on. I'm going to talk about also the different parts of a polis. I'll kind of talk about the Acropolis in the Agora, which are kind of famous with the Greek city-states as a whole. Of course, the one at Athens is really considered one of the most famous, as you might have seen before, or maybe have been there. Most city-states were built on a high point. That's true. It was done that for different reasons. I think primarily for defense. In case they got attacked by another state or some other power, they could use it to defend the state, and hold out against an enemy. But it's also used as like where they would put their temples, because I think they would put it on the highest point because they thought that would be close to God, like Zeus and all that. And so the term Acropolis, I think, means the high point of a city. It's kind of what it would, or some people say the top of the city. I think is another translation of what Acropolis means. And of course, the one at Athens is the most famous. They call it the Acropolis of Athens, or some people call it Acropolis Hill. I think is another term that they use as well. It's about 300-400 feet, by the way, above the rest of the city, like above sea level, roughly. Part of it was built up to fortify. It's got fortifications. You can kind of see on the wall. You can see that wall on the right side of it, of course, that you can see. They kind of help to fortify it. Yeah, it's over 400 feet, like 400. I thought it was 412 or something like that. It's about how tall it is, and compared to the rest of the city. And yeah, a lot of their buildings are in disrepair. I'll kind of show you. I think I've got some other pictures to show, which is a really good one here from a kind of a direct horizontal view of it right here. But a lot of their buildings, of course, have been either kind of declined in use, or, of course, if you know, the Parthenon was blown up, as you saw in the video, in the 17th century by the Venetians, and I think the Turks had used it as a supply depot for like gunpowder or something like that, weapons, and the Venetians hit it with cannon and it blew up. So that's why it looks the way it does. They're trying to supposedly rebuild part of it right now in the Republic of Athens. But anyway, so yeah, that's the Acropolis. But yeah, like I said, the temples were basically the main thing that they constructed the most. It was kind of like a civic center where the people could, meet there as well. But yeah, the Parthenon is the most famous building constructed on it. It was built in the 5th century, like more to the mid 5th century, by the famous politician Athens named Pericles. They think it was completed about 438. And Parthenon is very important because it's considered to be the most famous example of ancient Greece classical architecture. They employed a lot of artists, of course, to work on it. And of course, you saw in the video, it's kind of controversial because there's certain parts of the Parthenon that's still, that's owned by the British Museum, and they won't give it back. So it has to do some of the friezes that are kind of on the side of it, which are right here above the Doric columns that are on it. And a lot of that was like very famous, artwork for that time period. So a lot of these, stonemasons were very, very skilled. Of course, the Temple of Athena, Nike, another famous temple that's kind of right next to it. That's also very famous. But Athena, which we'll get to later, was considered their patron goddess, and there was believed to be this huge statue of her that was inside of it. That was, I want to say, made of marble, but it was supposedly engraved in gold, like solid gold. But anyway, now they also have what they call the agora, which the agora was, I guess, would be kind of comparable to the similar to the Roman Forum, like the Romans had in ancient times, and it's a central public square, like a town square, I guess, would be, the best place to describe what it would be for us, where the citizens of a city-state would meet, mostly primarily used for different things like business, public things, like public games would be put on, plays would be put on. Also, it's where a lot of the citizens would meet to discuss political means, to, like their assemblies would meet to discuss what to do with like running the state, passing various laws, etc. You can see the term agora or agora, I think it's said that way as well, is a Greek term meaning either, you can see, gathering place or assembly area. So it has been compared to the Roman Forum, kind of similar to it, although I think the Roman Forum is more extensive compared to that, because theirs was like added on over time in Rome. So those are like two sections of the city. And then most of Athens itself, like the city-state, was actually massive. They have like the city itself, which is kind of the capital of it, but Athens itself was about, I think, 1,200 square miles is the area that's on like where Attica is, which I'll kind of explain where that is later. But Athens is kind of located in the central part of the Attica Peninsula today. All right, I did want to get into also and talk about the fact that the Greeks had different forms of government that they kind of experimented, which is true about that. So I'll kind of talk about the different forms of government that they were kind of known for, like in ancient times. There's like 3 or 4 different types of, government they experiment. I'll put them on the screen, but democracy and oligarchy, the 2 traditional type of, governments that they pretty much experimented with overall. They also had a tyranny, like where they were run by tyrants. I'll get to that later. Also, a monarchy too. They had monarchies, but they were rare. Like Sparta had, if you know about the Sparta had 2 monarchies, 2 kings that they had that basically were part of their oligarchical system of government. They had kind of a different government compared to Athens. And it was part of what kind of created the rivalry between them because their politics was a little different from each other. Of course, the Athenians had the most famous type of government, which, of course, is democracy, Athenian democracy. And Athenian democracy is basically where the citizens of a state would basically directly participate in the government. So it meant like they would hold office. They would, of course, vote. And so everybody would participate if possible. Although I think early on there were restrictions on it, depending on your social class, how much land you owned, and things like that. But I think over time, most male citizens were able to participate in government. It's kind of like a boys' club. Women didn't really have any political rights, not too much in ancient medieval times overall. And so predominantly all the men would decide, what happened with the state, more or less. And I'll get to it later, but a lot of their elections, like if you held office, mostly how you were chosen was usually by a lot. You would just pick a random person out, usually pick out probably they usually had to put their names on pottery shards and put it in a pot. And then if your name got called, you got elected to whatever assembly that they had. The term democracy comes from the Greek word, which is demokratia, which means now ruled by the people. That's actually what it means. Suppose or government by or government by the people, if you want, as well. But it actually doesn't mean that in Greek. Demokratia actually means ruled by the tribes, because the Greeks were, like I talked about, divided into different tribes. And the word demi or demo is, of course, the Greek word, of course, meaning tribe. People don't use that term anymore. That's the origin of where it came from. Athenian democracy, of course, has been very influential, not just on the United States. It's influenced a lot of different countries in Europe, Britain, France, other countries throughout the world have been heavily influenced by it. And so that and the Roman forms of government, as well, to mix in with that. But Athenian democracy, is probably the most influential form of government that has influenced people, like I said, worldwide. They also had oligarchy, which was kind of popular throughout the Greek world, especially like in the Peloponnese. And this was a type of government where you had a state that was run by like a small group of people, usually like elitist types that were in the upper class, like aristocrats or nobility. They had like all the power and nobody else did. And the state that had that was Sparta. Sparta had that kind of government pretty much that they ran. And their state was basically run by the Spartans, all the different soldiers that were in the military. And nobody else had any power. Like most of Sparta was like slave that were under like slave or serfs that are called helots, but they had no political rights. I don't know if they're even considered real citizens of Sparta. Any middle class, any foreigners that went to Sparta, you couldn't fit in, of course. And so I'll get to later with Sparta, but Sparta is not a very open society, like say the Athenians, which it was. And so their particular state is heavily controlled by the Spartan elite. I told you they had, of course, 2 kings, which I'll get more into later, which were mostly hereditary. But they had also magistrates and assembly, like the Athenians have, of course, later as well. I'll get to that later about the government and all that that they had. They did have like what they call a tyranny, where they were ruled by these tyrants. Athens kind of experimented with that for a while. And tyrants were basically these upper-class aristocrats that usually seized power. They were very popular, by the way, with the lower classes, like the landless peasants, which I think in Athens or Greece they called thets. And anyway, they usually ruled without like an assembly, like a constitution. They're almost like a dictatorship, and that's what they evolve into later. If you study about Roman times, like Julius Caesar and all those other different dictators that rose to power that you've heard about, like Marcus, was it Sulla? I think it was Sulla and all that. No, Cornelius Sulla and Cornelius Sulla, and there was also that guy Mark Antony and all those other guys you hear about later, Octavian. All those guys were like dictators, of course, that you have, of course, later that are kind of like the tyrants. So, they did have kings, but like I said, they were rare. They didn't have too many of those. But the Athenians did experiment with tyrants, like early on, like 7th, 6th centuries. They had tyranny where they were ruled by these powerful aristocrats that were in power. There's 4 right there that were famous. Draco was one of them you may have heard of, who reigned in the 7th century. He was an Athenian lawmaker who was known for creating his so-called draconian laws that were very strict, that had a lot of capital punishment for different crimes. So they were famous. 6th century, they had Pisistratus. He was another famous tyrant that came in after Solon was ousted or left. They're not sure. But he, of course, was a famous tyrant that lived in the 6th century. And he had 2 sons, too, named Hipparchus and Hippias. They were also tyrants as well. So it almost like it'd be hereditary, almost like a king, sort of similar to it anyway. So, but yeah, the Athenians will experiment more with democracy. They'll kind of get rid of the tyrants later. Though, like in the 5th century, it's pretty much a democratic state overall. Right. Then the Greeks, of course, are known for their, if you read about, the Greek world and all that, they're famous for their hoplites, that come to power, that are part of their military. And most Greek city-states didn't really have a professional style army. They had what they call a militia, like some have today still, I guess, in some countries. And militias are these types of armies that are kind of like trained civilians that are among the population. They have like regular jobs, but they also act as, soldiers to protect the state in case of war breaks out, more or less. It's kind of like in American history with the American Revolution, the so-called Minutemen or something like that you may have heard about. That's kind of like a form of early militia, like in American history. That's a good example right there. Some states did have professional armies. So Sparta probably had, the best professional army, which I think their armies were only like 10,000 troops at one point, but it was like elite crack troops that were really good, probably the best in most of Greece. And the Macedonians were also known for their armies as well, like under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, who were known for their taking over Greece and Persia later. So we'll talk about both those states. Both those are known for military traditions who were all, like I said, the Greeks relied on what they call a hoplite. A hoplite was a type of infantry foot soldier, heavily armed, that primarily fought with a hoplite spear and used like these overlapping round shields that would protect them in formation in battle. It was almost like a melee, like a rugby match, the way it was between different formations that they fought in. And the type of formation that hoplites fought in, if you know about it, is called a phalanx. A phalanx is a type of rectangular shaped battle formation that the Greeks used, where men would basically form themselves into like a battle line of men with like spears, overlapping shields. And the idea of a hoplite phalanx, of course, would be to drive the other phalanx off the field. And you can see that the word phalanx means in Greek battle line. And usually with phalanxes, the soldiers in the back of the formation would literally push the men forward. They would use their shields. They'd push the guy in front of them with their shield, and they would try to shove the other phalanx off the field, and then try to kill them at the same time, using like mostly their spears, which they would stab at them. And they had different types of like armor and weapons that they would use in battle, like whether it be, of course, in phalanx formations or when they would go to single combat. When they would go to single combat, they would use swords, like the Greek short sword, and they would break formation. It's kind of like a melee, fighting each other, one against each other. And yeah, these are some of the different armor that they had that were very famous. Up there on the screen there, you can see they have what they call they have the hoplite cuirass, which the cuirass is like the bronze armor that would just overlap the torus of the body, which can weigh like something like 30, 40 pounds. It's pretty heavy. So yeah, that cuirasses have pretty much been used up to modern times, like up to the conquistadors, like when they invaded the New World and the Americas, etc. So that's a form of, armor that's real popular. Also, you can see on the right there, that picture, the Corinthian style helmet. That's what you're looking at there. That's a type of bronze helmet that was popularized by the city-state of Corinth. The Spartans used the same kind of helmet, by the way. And of course, it's known for its crest or plume that's on the top, which they use that for like an insignia. So if you see like I think it's made of horsehair usually, that plume on the top, of course, meant that you were like a infantry foot soldier, like a private or something like that, basically. And if you saw the plume facing you, if it's facing you instead, it's an officer. So it depends on which way it's facing, I guess. So also on the screen, I'll put, of course, you see right here on the right, there's different forms of armor they had as well. That would be kind of like a layered armor they had. I think that's a mix, really, of lamellar. It looks like linothorax. Looks like both of them, maybe. But lamellar is a type of layered armor that they would use, which I think went back to all the way to, you can go back to the Assyrians, who I think had that kind of armor they had. Then linothorax was another kind of armor, which was made of linen. That doesn't sound too good, but supposedly it was pretty good armor as well. But they say lamellar was the best armor to get because it was lighter and a lot better in battle to use overall. I'll get to the swords in a second about that, but they also have like, where's the greaves? There's also the greaves. There it is right there, the greaves. Yeah, greaves were used to defend like the legs and your knees. Also, they've had some on the forearms as well, like the block like sword blows and things like that as well. So those were used with different materials, bronze, sometimes leather, etc., maybe even linen, probably leather, mostly in bronze, primarily. Then on the bottom, you can see that's the so-called hoplon, or Greek round shield, which was usually 2 inches thick, made of oak wood. So they primarily used, like the oak tree. They usually put like a bronze casting on the outside. And some city-states would put like an insignia on the front, maybe a symbol to represent the state or whatever. I know I think it's the lambda. Is that the one? I believe it is. It would be the symbol that the Spartans would use, which is the inverted V. What it's looked like. Then you got weapons also as well. I can talk about. They had different kinds of weapons. They had primarily the main kind of weapon they used was the so-called dory or hoplite spear, which you can see he's got right here, which it varied in length. I think the length average from like 7 to 9, maybe 10 feet as well, but 8 or 9, I think, is usually the average length of the actual spear itself, which was, by the way, not a throwing spear. It was a thrusting spear, which you can see you obviously thrust it overhanded. And what you would do is you would basically try to, you have the shield in front of you and try to stab the guy in front of you is what you would do, of course, with the spear, as he was trying to stab you, pretty much. And it had 2 tips to it. One, of course, on the back had a weight, but it was also a secondary tip as well, in case the other side broke. I guess you could use the other tip. And they did have javelins. They were like 6 to 8 feet, which those would be thrown at the enemy as well, which the Romans were known for having javelins also being used in battle. You can see where the sword is actually put under the shield, like behind it, where you can just pull it out. Because, you got the spear it's kind of hard to hold a spear and a sword at the same time. That kind of deal. That's primarily where it kind of went, or if some people put it under the shield, or they put it on you, either one, I guess, where it could be, I guess. But anyway, of course, and then you got your swords as well. There's different kinds. They had the longer sword right there. They had, which the Greek sword was called the xiphos, which is just Greek for sword, is what it means. They had a curved sword, which was very popular with the Spartans. I think they call it the kopis, what they call the so-called curved sword. Usually longer swords might be used too with like cavalry also as well. So those are the kind of primary weapons they had. They did have what they call pikes or long spears, which pikes or long spears are called a sarissa in Greek. Those were heavily used later by the Macedonians that, developed that later in the 4th century, which were primarily used for, pikes are mostly used against cavalry, like in case infantry get attacked, they would be able to stop cavalry. That's primarily what it was, used for, pretty much. Right. So yeah, I'll get to later with getting into like the battles and all that and what they fought in. Of course, like the Spartans, were the ones that had the best army, pretty much they had in Greece. Then later the Macedonians in the 4th century also as well. But let me go ahead and talk a little bit about, of course, the rise of Sparta in Athens, of course, which, that's one of the things that really dominates really Greek history around the 5th century is those 2 powers. They were kind of at each other's throat, pretty much. And so, yeah, the Spartans, a little bit of background about who they were. Sparta developed, I've got a map showing you where Sparta is. It's in what they call the Peloponnese. So I've got 2 maps I've got actually of it right here. But they developed in most of this area called Laconia. It has different names. Laconia is a common name, but that's the area where the Spartans rose out of in the Peloponnese, which I told you, the Peloponnese is this large-sized peninsula, which is on the bottom of Greece, southern Greece. Looks like a 4-fingered hand, like the thumb's missing or something like that. And Laconia was like what they called the Spartan homeland, or its nation, country where it lived pretty much. That's the common name. They still call that area of modern Greece today, Laconia, which is spelled with a K or a C, either way. However, they did have an ancient name, they called it, which is Lacedaemon, which you see there on the bottom. And Lacedaemon was a name supposedly that originated from one of the sons of Zeus in ancient Greek mythology. Yeah, he was a son of Zeus, who supposedly came to where Sparta is, and he became one of its first kings, like the king of Laconia, I guess a long time ago before they called it Sparta and all that. And supposedly the city of Sparta was named after his wife. He had a wife named Sparta, and so the name came from that. I don't know if you know that, but that's where the name came from, they say anyway. At least that's the theory, but it's probably mythology, more or less. But what we know about the Spartans is that they were descended from the Dorians. I told you that Dorian invasion that came in, I told you about in the Greek Dark Ages that occurred. They came in, they started settling that part of the Peloponnese. In fact, a lot of the Dorians settled in the southern part of Greece, mostly. And over time, they had this state that rose there, which later was called Sparta. As you know, the city-state, the state itself, both are called that pretty much. And Sparta kind of becomes the prominence like 8th, 7th century overall. Of course, a lot of historians confuse Sparta, with the old Sparta, the one that was like, the one in the Mycenaean Sparta, like, what was it, Menelaus and all that, which they're not sure if that was real or not. That Sparta, like a long time ago. That's, through Homer's, like Iliad, Odyssey, whatever. But they do know that maybe there was a founding father of Sparta who was named King Lycurgus, who lived maybe 8th century, although it's been debated about whether Lycurgus was real or not. Some believe he was maybe a mythical type person that wasn't real. I think Plutarch is one of the main Greek writers that writes about the history of the Spartans. He's got a lot of history on them. Plutarch lived about 2,000 years ago, roughly. But anyway, Lycurgus was famous for being the founder of their constitution. He's like, the guy that created all their laws, their court systems, their assemblies, their military academy, and all that. So he's very, very important. They say that their laws were named after him. They were called the Code of Lycurgus, which originally were supposedly oral in tradition and were later written down, more or less. And so he's the one that maybe created the laws, but they may have been created by other people, also as well, that came later. But like I said, they're not sure if Lycurgus is real or not. It's kind of a debate about that overall. They do know that between the 8th and 7th centuries, the Spartans started, developing their military schools, which were called the Agog, what they often called it, the Spartan Agog. The Agog was a Greek term that means to rear, like to raise someone. And supposedly what happened was Spartan boys primarily were taken from their parents at the age of 7. They started educating them and training them for war. And they would try to, form them into future soldiers that would be part of the Spartan army. And so the Spartans only wanted the strongest. They didn't want, people that were weak. And if you know about the Spartans, when a baby was born, the elders would check the baby and see if it was, strong enough or whatever. And if it was weak, they would take it somewhere and leave it to die. They didn't want any weak people or anything like that. And most Spartan armies only had like 10,000 soldiers in it. That's it. At one point, I think that's all the men they had total. It was a very small population, but they were, like I said, very good crack troops. The Spartans were educated from the age of 7 to about 21. All Spartans had to go through the school. If you didn't, you couldn't become a Spartan citizen. It was almost like you were ostracized, pretty much. The only ones that were exempt were the king's sons. They didn't have to go through the training and all that, etc. You graduate at 21. So 7 to 21, it's like almost like high school and college, I guess. From there, what happened from the age of 21 to 30, you then would live in barracks, like in a mess with other Spartan boys. This is like for 10 years, something like 9, 10 years that you live together, kind of like Marines or something like that. And the Spartans were a very egalitarian society. Like everybody was kind of considered equal among men. So you fought together, you lived together, you ate together, etc. And then when you turn 30, you then would become what they call a full Spartan citizen. They sometimes call it a Spartiate, which I think I put on the screen I think that's sometimes a term that they use to describe a Spartan citizen, Spartiate. And from there, you had all the rights to like participate even like in the government, like hold office, vote, etc. So Spartan girls were educated too. Don't forget about that. They had some kind of state-sponsored education, where girls would be educated in different things. You can see sports, dance, poetry, music, writing, some kind of forms of war education also as well. However, Spartan girls or women later were primarily used to, like I said, have children, which would be future warriors that would be in the Spartan army. But quite often there were more women than men. I don't know if you know much about that at Sparta, but a lot of times they had multiple men, I guess they were with and all that, because there were just not as many men. So anyway, and of course the other thing, and yeah, of course I'll get to it later, but we'll talk more about the Spartans in war and all that. But the Spartans they lack culture. They didn't have much culture. They didn't have art. Suppose there's a saying that the term Lacedaemonia, which is I think the term that they sometimes use to describe Sparta, like the country, was a term that meant to speak concisely, because the Spartans were a very serious people. They had some humor, but it was like a serious type humor, more or less. But they didn't have much culture, didn't have a lot of art. Pretty much their whole society is based off of military, and they're famous for their battles. You can see a battle of Thermopylae, battle of Plataea. Both those are famous battles that were fought in the Greco-Persian Wars. That are, well, I guess Thermopylae is now the most famous battle that they're known for now overall. And they're also known for, you see that picture, that map there on the right, the Spartans expanded. They controlled that area on the right in that dark red area, Laconia, but they also took over an area called Messenia that was to the west of it. And Messenia is an area that was controlled by other, I guess, Greeks that were there, and they subjugated them. And they became like slaves, or some people call them serfs, but I think some people consider them to be more like slaves. And they used them for their agriculture, like, growing their crops and all that, and running their economy. And they were later called helots, the term helot. And they heavily outnumbered the Spartans. I think Herodotus claims that it was something like 7-1, the difference in the population difference between the helots versus the Spartans. And so that's part of why the Spartans developed a military society to basically prevent them from revolting, because there are many cases where there would be helot revolts. They'd have to put it down, to stay in power and all that. Helots had no power. They weren't really considered citizens of Sparta. So they had no rights. There were many cases where Spartans, when they're in their training, they would actually sneak out their barracks and they would try to kill a helot without getting caught. It was a form of stealth they were trying to learn, which they could pretty much do at will. So the Spartans wanted to kill them, they could. They're kind of like slaves to them. Oh, and the Spartans, I already told you, have like they have like a, pretty much like an oligarchy, I told you, with 2 hereditary kings, which were mostly advised by magistrates. They're called ephors. I think there are like 5 of them that were kind of like these chief magistrates that ran the state. They also had these council of elders. It was called a Gerousia, which had like a bunch of men on, like maybe 30 people on it or so. And they helped with running the state and advising the kings. They did have an assembly that was called the Apella, where Spartan men that I guess were around 30 and older could participate in. So Sparta was different from Athens that had democracy, like I told you before. Right, I've got a few minutes. Let me also talk about the Athenians as well, which developed on the so-called Attica Peninsula, which you can see right there. Attica is located, it's about 150 miles to the northeast of Sparta. It's like right below where Boeotia is, which is right above it, kind of to the west of that map. And it's a 1,200 square mile area where Athens, like its capital, develops. It's pretty much where the capital of Athens, a capital of Greece, is today. It's right in that area you're looking at on the coast. And Athens is very famous for its culture, like its Greek culture, so-called birthplace, I told you, of Western civilization or Western culture. It's highly influential. Everybody, of course, has been influenced by the Greeks, whether it be culture, arts, philosophy, history, democracy, architecture, you name it, plays or whatever. So they're mostly known for that compared to Sparta, which didn't have much culture, but mostly war. They're a very open society, too. You could go there, be part of Athens, etc. Like Herodotus was from Turkey and came there as an example. Aristotle from Macedonia came there also as well. Also, maritime trade was very important. They're known for their naval power. The Athenians are famous for exporting different goods, especially olive oil, which was very important later. For a long time, Greece was the main export of olive oil. I don't think anymore. Spain or Italy now, but it was at one point. Of course, Athens is named for Athena, the famous daughter, of Zeus, the famous goddess of war, also wisdom and peace. And of course, the Parthenon was built in her honor, of course, but it was also a war memorial, I'll get to later, to honor different soldiers that had died in the Greco-Persian Wars as well. Athena is also known for supposedly giving the Athenians the so-called olive tree, the olive, which supposedly first grew on the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is and all that. I already told you about Athenian democracy, of course, which originally was, they didn't have that at first. They had like a type of, tyranny ruled by tyrants like Draco, but they eventually got rid of draconian type laws in the 6th century, like early 6th century. They started kind of going away from that. And there was this man named Solon, who I'll talk about today, who was very influential. Solon, of course, if you know about him, was considered to be one of the fathers of Athenian democracy. It's him and Cleisthenes and Pericles, I think, are also considered important fathers of Athenian democracy that helped kind of develop it in ancient Greece. And Solon was the one who developed a lot of their constitution, like their court systems, their laws, their assemblies. So those are things that he was known for, that was very famous. He also ended a lot of debt for slavery. Like if you had debt you owed, you could be enslaved, or your children could be enslaved. He ended that. He got rid of draconian type capital punishment, where you could be put to death for anything. So after that, I think the Athenians decided that only murder could be a capital punishment. Solon, of course, also created the so-called social system that they had in Athens. He divided the population into 4 classes. The upper class, which was composed of aristocrats and knights. The middle class, which was like your farmers mostly, which were like hoplite soldiers primarily. A lot of your skilled labor, like artisans, etc., were also part of that. And your lower class was your landless peasants that worked the land. They didn't own land, but they worked it as kind of helping farmers out. And they were like called the thets often in Greece. So they're on the bottom. They're later the ones that row the ships, like in the Greco-Persian War. So you hear about that. They say Solon founded 2 assemblies. They're not sure if this is true or not. Maybe it's mythical, maybe, but Ecclesia, of course, was the primary one, which was the main assembly of all citizens, where a majority of citizens could participate. And the Council of 400 was a special assembly of 400 delegates that was elected annually, like every year, pretty much. And a Greek consul was called a bulle, is what they dubbed it, which the Romans called a assembly, also a consul as well. So a lot of times elections were by lot, Like if you got elected, it was pretty much by lot, especially with the Council of 400 or later the 500 that came later under Cleisthenes. He also created their main court system as well, which is called the Areopagus, which means usually hill of Ares. Some people say rock of Ares also as well. It's a type of appellate court system, like appeals court, where it's like a Supreme Court, where like you had basically Greek Athenian elders would basically deal with like appeals cases, capital punishment cases, more or less. And one of the most famous cases they heard, if you know about this, 399 BC, was the trial of Socrates, where Socrates was put to death. He could have gone into exile, but he was put to death. He chose poison, if you know about that. Solon's the one that also developed the olive oil industry too, which is true about that as well, which the Athenians were very famous for their olive oil, which they exported. And it helped drive their economy later, which eventually rose into the so-called Achaemenid Empire, which peaked later in the 5th century, mid-5th century, of course, BC. I don't have a picture of him, but Cleisthenes was a later famous politician that was in Athens, and he was very well known for later restoring democracy. Solon later left Athens close to 560. There's been a debate about whether he got ostracized, but I think he just left and traveled throughout the Mediterranean region for some reason. I'm not sure why, but he left, supposedly according to Herodotus. And eventually what happened was he put basically the democracy back in with help from Sparta. Sparta, which was more known for their oligarchy. And that angered the Spartans. Spartans wanted Athens to have a government like they had, like an oligarchy. But Cleisthenes, of course, restored what they had before, going back to Solon's time. And so Cleisthenes would go on to found the so-called Council of 500, which was a new type of assembly, which had 500 delegates or representatives that represented the city-state of Athens. It was, by the way, considered one of the first true democratic assemblies because of the fact that they divide up Athens into different voting districts, where each district would basically elect certain delegates. I forget how many it was, but I thought it was like 50 each, like 10 districts with 50 delegates or something like that. And that was kind of considered like an early form of democratic voting that you have later, like they have now today. Cleisthenes also developed the so-called ostracism, where if someone like is like against the state, they could just ostracize them, like they're considered like a threat or whatever. I think they did that because of the tyrants like Pisistratus that had tried to seize power at one point. And that's why they did that, more or less. Now later, I'm going to be talking about next class, which will be like Wednesday. I'll kind of have another lecture coming up. I didn't really have time today, but I'll get into the so-called Greco-Persian Wars that come in. I'll get to that later. We'll talk about that subject because that's going to break out in the close to 500 BC, where Greece ends up in a war with the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire. That's, of course, a major event in Greek history that's well known. So I'll get to that. I'll talk about the aftermath of the Greco-Persian Wars that occurs. And then I'll get into like also classical Greek culture. We'll also talk about that as well. And so before I go, don't forget, I do have some reminders about assignments. Of course, that new China quiz, of course, has been posted. Don't forget about that. That, of course, will be due next week. I think midweek next week. Don't forget that new vocab, second vocab, of course, is also due on Friday this week. So you can start posting that in the speed grader for me to grade pretty much. So looks like no questions today, pretty much. But if you have a comment, question, later about this lecture, let me know. Of course, as you always do, of course, through my channel. I'll see you on Wednesday, of course, for my part 3 lecture, of course, on ancient Greece. Y'all have a good rest of the week, by the way, and I'll talk to you later. So y'all take care. I'll see you later this week.